Thank you so much for having me. It is a real pleasure to be here in this space of care and peace, and I'm very grateful. Um, I wanted to say something about the Cesar Vallejo poem that we began with, and which is in the program. First thing is, I did not translate the poem, but I am a translator from Spanish. So as a translator, I should have put the names of the translators. So that this piece was translated by Valentino Giannuzzi and Michael Smith, and it was written by Cesar Vallejo, who's a Peruvian poet, in 1919. Vallejo had a very interesting life. He was born in a small village in Peru. He was part indigenous, and his indigenous roots come out a lot in his writing, and that's at a time when it would not have been particularly common to see indigenous thought expressed in literature. He is arrested in Peru at some point for some suspicious reasons, and suffered quite a bit, and then eventually moves to Europe, and lives in Europe, and lives and dies in Europe and France, and is also very active in thinking about and writing about the Spanish Civil War. At any rate, I included this piece because it is, on one level, just simply one of my favorite poems, but something that the lines at the beginning, hay golpes en la vida tan fuerte, yo no sé. There are blows in life so powerful, I don't know. That I believe spur me to write. And I'm particularly interested in his repetition of the phrase, I don't know. And that we are constantly being asked to consider the circumstances. We are constantly being asked to consider these blows in different ways. Some of us personally in our bodies and to ourselves, and others of us through what we observe. And I think what has spurred me to write has been the sense that that I don't really know how to respond to pain that is so powerful, to the atrocities that other people are experiencing, and to things that are happening directly around me, and that the one thing I maybe do know how to do is to write. And to try to articulate with some form of honesty what I observe and what I see. And so we were speaking in the inquiry this morning, and the question I had posed is, how do we respond when so many atrocities are happening at once, and that those atrocities can be both personal and global, right? But and there are many, of course, everybody has different ways of responding emotionally, intellectually. But I suppose for me, what I can do is how I respond, how I am able to stay sane, perhaps, in the face of so much, is through writing. So I will begin there. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to read from a few different pieces, and then talk as well. So I'm going to begin by reading from an essay which is simply called Writing. And it's an introduction to my book, which is called In the Murmurs of the Rotten Carcass Economy. And I'm going to start there because I think it will introduce some of the things that I care about as a writer. Where there's context and names that come up, I will do my best to explain them. So this is called Writing, and it is for and after the French novelist and resistance fighter Marguerite Duras. 1. If there weren't things like this, writes Marguerite Duras in her essay, The Death of the Young British Pilot, writing would never take place. But even if writing is there, always ready to scream, to cry, one does not write it. Emotions of that order, very subtle, very profound, very carnal and essential and completely unpredictable, can hatch entire lives in a body. That's what writing is. It's the pace of the written word passing through your body, crossing it. That's where one starts to talk about those emotions that are hard to say, that are so foreign, and yet that suddenly grab hold of you. If there weren't things like this, writes Duras, and by things she means anonymous bodies that fall out of airplanes. He was an orphan, so the essay again is called The Death of the Young British Pilot, and she's describing the experience of going to a village in France where this young British pilot during the Second World War, essentially, a plane was shot down and he was found there in the village. So he was an orphan and had no family and was found dead in a village in France. One of his school teachers would come from England every year to put flowers on his grave. He's a corpse, a 20-year-old corpse who will go on to the end of time. If there weren't things like this, writes Duras, a writing of ghostliness, of anonymous corpses, of anonymous love, a writing of love, anonymity, attention. This is a story I was once told. A corpse was thrown out of an airplane. This is a story that consists not of words, but of images. There is a woman in her apartment. We are at the dining room table drinking tea, looking out at the smog of a gray winter day. She is telling me about a family member. She is telling me why he went to live where he went to live. She is telling me about his brother, young, a radical, didn't know what he was doing, was organizing a factory. There was a girlfriend. The police came in. She pretended like she was one of the workers. An image of a scarf, a head wrap, a bandana she pulls over her head to fit in with one of the factory workers. She is telling me about the man's brother. His name was S., arrested at the factory trying to organize the workers. He disappeared. His parents went to one country, his brother to another. I don't know the sequences here. The facts might be wrong. It doesn't really matter. His parents moved overseas. They got a call one day. They were asked to fly to a mountain village to identify a body that had an identification card with their son's name on it. They flew across the ocean, found their way to the mountain village to identify the body. It wasn't their son. I've thought about these words forever. I've thought about this story forever, and I refuse to verify its authenticity, its truthfulness, because it's possible that this story, these images, have been at the root of every single word that I write. And I've never really explained this little piece of writing, but I suppose I will now. So my family is from Chile, and I'm writing about a conversation here that I remember having with my grandmother, where she was telling me about a distant family member who had died under the military dictatorship, and then what had happened to the family member. And she told me the story. She's no longer alive. But when I say I'm not sure if it's true. I suppose that's true because I don't have her to verify it. But this is what I remember her telling me. And I remember the story about his parents having moved abroad and then getting a call and flying to a small village in Argentina to identify the body. But it wasn't actually their son. And so they had come all this way to identify a body that was not, that did not belong to their son. As I say, I refuse to verify its authenticity and its truthfulness, and there's a sense in which even if I'm getting the facts wrong, I think the truths of the story remain. One day, while I'm writing, I write the following. That is, I have the following dream while typing on the computer. I'm standing by a fence in the desert. The fence separates country A from country B. There are bodies climbing over the fence. They get to the top, and for a moment, they hover between country A and country B. Then they hop down to country B, and as they drop, their faces fall off their bodies. They hop down from the fence and search in the mud for their faces, but the lips they find are not their lips. The mouths they find are not their mouths. The eyes they found are not their eyes, but they keep these parts all the same and run past the early Americans who are napping at the border. Later, I am writing and watching myself walking through the desert, searching for a particular hole when a brutal dog attacks me. It attempts to bite off my arm, but the dog's owner is confused by my skin. It changes colors. So he pulls the dog away, spanks it, and proposes certain theories about the need to alter the dog's intrinsic nature. What leaks out of the dog is a human combination of love, anger, and devotion. What leaks out of the human is a hybrid combination of intellect, desire, and monstrosity. I remove my arm before the dog can yank it completely from my body, and when I attempt to patch up the leaking blood, I suddenly feel the urge to write. I dip my finger in the blood and start to compose letters on my skin, but then there is nothing to say. Marguerite Duras. Finding yourself in a hole, at the bottom of a hole, in almost total solitude, and discovering that only writing can save you. Because I am surrounded by people who murmur with no voice, because I am surrounded by people who die with no voice, because everywhere houses and streets and cities and states and nations collapse when no voice. And I'm going to mention Raul Zurita, who is a Chilean poet who I've translated quite a bit of. He's one of the best-known living Chilean poets, if not Spanish language poets at the moment. In 1973, on the day of the military coup, he and his entire university, as he explains it, were arrested, and he spent 6 weeks imprisoned on a prison ship. He never finished his degree, and has spent his entire writing life really reflecting on what it means to be from a country that has destroyed itself and that has destroyed its people, and on how to live with those types of atrocities. And then one day I am listening to Raul Zurita speak, and he is answering a question about why nature, why the rocks, the sea, and the mountains have been so important to him. And he says that the beaches and the mountains and the sea were so much kinder to the bodies that were thrown out of airplanes than the military or the government had been. He does not explain this any further, and no one presses the point, but afterwards I can't help but think forever about absorption, about what it means to be absorbed, about how a community, a city, a country, a nation absorbs or refuses to absorb its bodies, its ghosts, its citizens. A writing, then, of absorption, of envelopment, of dissolution, of evaporation, because everywhere there are people with no voice who cannot be absorbed, because there are things like this, because there are unabsorbed bodies, writing continues to take place. Every book has sentences in it that the writer hates, that the writer cannot get rid of, that the writer cannot live without. Any writer who cuts out every sentence he hates is a writer not worth reading. But what's even worse than this are the sentences the writer loves, the sentences the writer needs, the sentences that created the book, but which the writer absolutely cannot include. Doubt, writes Marguerite Duras, equals writing, to which I would add that I have little interest in writing that does not make a mess of itself of the world, of its own reason for being. One can write towards a reduction. One can begin with a mess of words and then hope in the end for a beautiful and satisfying reduction of that mess. One can consciously work towards a reduction in the ability of the writing body to be absorbed by the words it murmurs to everyone and no one in particular. The nicest thing anyone has ever said to me about my writing is that it is brave. I stared stupidly at this person after she said this, though I was immensely grateful. I stared stupidly and said nothing, because really there is nothing to say about anything you have written. It's not easy to tell someone that the reason you write is because it's always impossible to sleep. And then I am on the floor next to the bed, not sleeping and writing and dreaming, and there is a 90-year-old woman who shoots herself inside her bedroom while the sheriff stands outside the door of her foreclosed home with an eviction notice, and she murmurs to me while I try to sleep. She joins with the murmurers of the rotten carcass economy to form a chorus who participate in this drama, which may or may not be about how I will never be able to sleep. And finally, I close my eyes on a bed of broken bones. We are in Chicago, and the choral murmurers are in purgatory, and they want to know what it is to be done now that the bubble has popped. And they ask me this while I don't sleep, and they tell me a little story. They sing. Once there was a native body who decided to build a foreign body for mass consumption, but the body was indigestible. The children tried to eat it, but the flesh was rotten. The economists went silent. They did not want to publish their quantifications of the values of the deteriorating foreign bodies. But there was sunshine, data bodies. In fact, it was a marvelous day for the beach. One of the things that we were talking as well this morning. So we were talking as we were talking this morning about the question of how to respond to so many atrocities happening at the same time. Partly, this is a question that has been spurring me to write ever since I started writing over 20 years ago now. And then partly it was maybe reignited a few weeks ago by my 10-year-old son here, Lorenzo, who we were listening to the news, and I think we were, and he asked the question. So this was the week that the healthcare bill was in debate, as well as the ban, the bill to ban immigrants from Muslim countries arriving. And I don't mean to make assumptions about anyone's politics, really, but the question he posed to me was, which one is worse? I was very struck by that question. Because again, I didn't quite know how to answer, and I want to maybe abstract from those two issues, but make it perhaps more applicable outside of that particular context, and to think that part of what we're always being asked to do is to quantify how the various atrocities that we see around us affect us, right? And how perhaps a political strategy that is happening at the moment, but one that is not particularly new, is to bombard us one after the other with really bad news all of the time, with terrible ideas, terrible policies, terrible proposals. And so once we sort of feel as if we have a grip on what happened last week, then we have to deal with what is happening today. And the feeling is one of great overwhelmingness, right? And I think part of what I struggle with is how not to despair in the face of these, let's call them atrocities that compete for our attention, and which compete for our attention because of because of, on the one hand, the news cycle and because of perhaps whatever world we're living in. So Lorenzo kind of reformulated that question to me, and it's one that I was thinking about, have been thinking about for a very long time, but which kind of came back to me in that form. And so I'm going to read a piece which speaks to that, called The Book of Equality. And this is from my book called The Book of Interfering Bodies, which was published in 2011. And part of what spawned this piece of writing was the experience of watching the news and the kind of flatness of it, that everything is communicated to us with the same kind of emotional levelness. And that's, I suppose, what a television news reporter's job is to do, right? But we are kind of left to muddle about in the gravity of that. So this is called The Book of Equality. Here the readers gather to watch the books die. They die suddenly, as if thrown from an airplane or from spontaneous cardiac arrest. They live, and then suddenly they die. And the reader who watches this is, at the moment of the book's death, bombarded with images, documented through the smiling lipstick face of a journalist who has shown up to report on the death of the books. The milk was poisoned and 42 babies died, she laughs as she fondles the ashes of the dead books. And the death of 42 babies is equal in value to the death of this book, which is equal in value to the 90-year-old woman who shot herself while the sheriff waited at her door with an eviction notice, which is equal in value to the collapsing of the global economy, which is equal to the military and country XYZ seizing the land of the semi-nomadic hunters and cultivators of crops who have lived in the local rainforest for thousands of years. The reader opens a dead book and finds an infinite amount of burnt ash between the bindings. When the ash blows in the wind, the lipstick says that every death in the world is equal to every other death in the world, which is equal to every birth in the world, which is equal to every act of dismemberment, which is equal to the death of a jungle, which is equal to the collapse of the global economy. And hey, look, another lady falling out of a window. She looks equal to the poet hurled out of his country for words he wrote, but which did not belong to him, and whose death is about equal to the girl who was shot on the bus on her way to school this morning, which is just about the same as the bearded man whose head was shoved into a sack while water was dumped over it, and he died for an instant and came back to life and talked, and that's about equal to the steroid illegally injected into the arm of a beautiful man who makes $40 million a year for injecting his arm with steroids so he can more skillfully wave a wooden stick at a ball. And in the ash, we see the truest democracy there ever was. Look, it's a baby and a dumpster. How equal you are, says the smiling lipstick to the civilized nation whose citizens walk the flooded streets looking for their homes. And in the ashes of the dead book, the dead streets are equal to the eating disorders of movie stars, which are equal to the dead soldiers, who are equal to the home runs, which are equal to the bomb dropped by country ABC over weddings in the village of country XYZ, which is equal to the earth swallowing up and devouring all of its foreigners, which is just about equal to the decline in literacy in the most educated nation in the planet. There is no end to this book. There are no paragraph breaks to interrupt the smiling lipstick that goes on in one string of ashy words about how the declaration of peace is equal to the resumption of war, and how the bodies that fall are equal to the birds that ascend, and how the bomb in the Eiffel Tower is equal to the rising cost of natural gas. And the murmurs of the voices in the mud are equal to the murmurs of the expensive suits falling out of buildings, and these are equal to the silence that kills with one breath and coddles life with another. And I'll conclude by just saying a few words about the other part of, I had two inquiry questions this morning, and so my last book is called The Performance of Becoming Human, and the question we discussed this morning had to do with whether or not becoming human or becoming more human is something which is desirable or not. And we talked both about humanity and humanness, as well as the issue of performance to some extent. And so the title of the book is referencing a story by Kafka called A Report to an Academy. The premise of this story is that there are a group of European soldiers who go to Africa and shoot an ape to bring back to Europe to study. So it has all kinds of implications about colonialism and the pillaging of a country, but as well as enslavement. The ape is, so it's told from the point of view of the ape, who eventually goes on to give the report to a scientific academy. And the ape is caught on the ship, is imprisoned in the ship, and is essentially encaged in a space about this big, and is trying to figure out what to do. And realizes that he has, as Kafka writes, no way out of his situation. So he decides that his only way out is to attempt to become human, which he does by observing first, and then aping or imitating the people on the ship who sit around drinking and belching and spitting in each other's faces and doing crude things all of the time. And so eventually, at some point, he kind of grabs a bottle of their liquor and gets drunk. And this allows him to perform, to attempt his performance at becoming human, and he breaks into speech at that point. He'd been kind of experimenting by doing some of the things he saw the humans doing. So at some point he starts belching and he spits tobacco and he spits in their faces, and they're very charmed by this. And then eventually he breaks into speech and says the entire time that it's not what he wants to do, but it's that he feels as if he has no choice but to attempt to survive by adapting to this environment around him. If there's an irony to the story, it's that he becomes much more human than the actual human beings, and goes on to kind of give lectures in scientific community and throughout Europe. So that is kind of what led to that question a bit and led to the writing of the book, but which has gotten me thinking for many years about how we perform our humanity in our given communities, right? And if there's a kind of pattern that's demonstrated in the story, which is relevant to all of our lives, right, is that in order to become a part of a community, there is a performance that happens, and that performance has to do with observing, imitating, and then sort of being brave enough to try to perform or become a member of that community. I suppose we can then say becoming an individual means somehow surpassing that and going on to do things that stand out among that community, right? But to stand out, you need that community, right? To be the individual, you need a community to be aware of you within that context. And again, I think part of this also has to do with our limitations and how we must always make decisions on what kind of performance, what kind of human we want to become based on what we are limited by, right? And so for some people, the limitations placed upon them are much graver than for others. Some people are limited simply by the bodies that they live in, the families they are born into, the color of their skin, the amount of money that they have, and the communities that they come from. And the choices that people in those situations will make are going to be very different than the choices that people with more privileges will end up making. But these are some of the questions that I've been thinking about for a long time. And so I will conclude with just a short piece from the performance of Becoming Human, and then we can speak more later. And this is called The Devouring Economy of Nature. Let's begin at the end, she says. The best way to end a sentence is with the word blank. It is midnight, and I am lonely, and your blank is the blank of my blank. He ran through the party thrown to celebrate the hanging of the other body. He trampled cold chicken and biscuits, or he ran through the silhouettes of the hanging bodies, or he possessed the fortitude needed to refuse to begin another act of language. I refuse to write the middle of the story. There is water everywhere. There is a flood on my street, and I am sleeping in a body much too big for my bed. In fact, I'm sleeping in a bed much too big for my house. The flood has changed the proportions from my house to my bed to my body, or at least my perception of the proportions. Did you hear the one about the immigrant laborer run over by a tractor? In his pocket was a photograph of his cousin, Eva, a 13-year-old in a refugee camp in another country. As the tractor ran him over, he kept shouting to his fellow workers, "Please, somebody marry Eva." And to mourn the death of the workers, the children sang a song called Other People's Bodies. They sang it to the tune of a current popular song. There was a dance routine that involved hand motions and little hops and the thrusting of booties in and out. And as the song developed, the progression of data became increasingly relevant, for as the children sang, they slowly began to understand that they would never see their parents again, that they had been taken from their homes and tossed into the pools in order to fulfill the required data specifications outlined by the city, the state, and the country. Or a barbarian and an economist walk into a bar. The barbarian says, "I dreamt we were in a swimming pool and you were swimming towards me. I was sitting on the wall, and when you got to the wall dissolved into the water and the pool stretched out endlessly, and there were hundreds of children swimming in the pool, and they were looking for their parents. There were men in orange wetsuits painting lines throughout the water, over the water, and the lines were different colors, and they struck to the surface of the water, and we understood that certain colors meant certain things, and you picked up a drowning child and said, 'Here is a small piece of data.' I won't tell you what this data means in relation to the other data that will determine the relationship between your desire to eat the children and the future prosperity of the nation." The economist orders 2 martinis and says to the barbarian, "There is something frozen here. I see you standing in front of the pool, and I know that the you who is standing there is the you who has uttered this sentence so many times before. When you spit out the sentence, they will say that it did not come from your mouth, that it came from the mouth of the person who is performing this act of being you." In other words, linguistic theory opens the door to the possibility that we are not ethically responsible for our actions. And the barbarian says, even if money doesn't exist, there will always be an audience for economists. And they take the water from the river and put it in the back of several trucks. And from the dried up river, there emerges a country. And in the country, there are children who have been invented by people who made money and things that don't actually exist. And they don't say, "Why are you taking the water from the river?" And they don't think, "Why are you shaving the fur from the bodies of our dogs?" The children sit on the sofa placed perfectly in a picturesque location on the river. The dogs are arranged so that they rest in front of the sofa. The photographer asks the children to smile so that the rest of the world can see how well we treat the displaced people. "Do you want to see what you look like?" the photographer says to the children. The children look at their images without recognition, stuck as they are in the fantasy life of the economists. And the barbarian says, "Do we really need this, kids? Do I really need this job?" 3 dogs guard the 2 children. I will write their story, but I will not understand it. The doctor says, "Yes, in Illinois, we love a war between states across borders, both real and imagined." Or, did you hear the one about the boy thrown into the fire? His charred body was hacked up and fed to dogs while his parents watched from a cage. The economist, formerly of the working class, only got married so that he could demonstrate that it was possible for a, quote, kid like me to move into high society. According to the data, it is impossible for rich people to be friends with poor people. This, according to the data, is true in all societies. Thank you.